here on The Hash with Hatfield. Matt Hatfield, please be joined by a special guest. He's a longtime broadcaster in the Richmond area. I think he's been doing it for 30-plus years. He'll give us the exact year when he started and his background and talk about some of the teams in the 804 area code in Richmond, as we've got some teams across the Richmond and Tidewater areas intermingling like they always do come postseason time with the regional playoffs starting in a little bit more than a week here. He is the sports director at Odyssey Richmond, also sports anchor at WRVA, veteran voice of high school football on 910 The Fan, alongside Gary Criswell. It's the Gary and Gary Show. We're now pleased to be joined by Gary Hess here on the podcast. How you doing, my friend?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It is good to have you on this edition of the podcast. We've had you for many years alongside yours truly and Coach Ed Young on our radio shows. And I know you're a frequent visitor to us on VirginiaPreps.com too, but it's good to catch up with you. And let's introduce you to the audience that are not familiar with your work. You've been doing it. What year is this for you on the mic as the voice of high school football in the RVA and the 804?
This is actually my 30th year. It would have been 31, but we did not do the spring COVID season. So my first year was 93. So this would have been 31, but it's actually my 30th year on the mic calling high school football games on 910 here in the Richmond area.
I actually got a chance myself to coming back from the much anticipated Phoebus Warwick battle at Todd Stadium to punch you guys up, you and Gary Criswell, on the radio dial, as it was the great finish to Highland Springs and Varina, which is also a equally massive game of the year type of matchup in the 804 as it is every year with Highland Springs and Varina, two Capital District rivals, which we'll get to in a moment. But how did you get involved with this high school football? I know you've got to love it, because if you do it as long as you've done it, I've done it, a lot of people that follow this, you've got to be a lifer in this thing.
I do. It's so funny, and you will appreciate this. Some of the logistical things you deal with during the week, I get kind of tired of, but Friday nights never get old. Never get old. I love being a part of it, for, the whole thing, being at the games, in the Varina Highland Springs case, Saturday afternoons. And then, it's one of the fun things for us is doing a game of the week. We play it down the middle. We're unbiased all season long. We get to the state playoffs, we travel with one of our teams, and then we get to be homers and root for our local team. So that's one of the things we love. And yeah, you're right. I mean, kind of a lifer, but I think you asked me how I got into it. And it's kind of funny because in 1994, I was working for the Virginia News Network, and we moved up to Church Hill to the famous WRVA building when Clear Channel had bought both entities. And WRNL had been starting to transition to a sports station. And in that process, right before we moved, a gentleman named Mike O'Toole, who was one of our sales guys at the time, decided we should start trying to do high school football. And there were several guys that kind of jumped in and did play-by-play duties that first year. And I did the playoff games. And by the second year, it was pretty much me and Robert Fish, and mostly me, and on from there. And for several years, Mike kind of drove the bus, and then I took the baton, and it's just kind of become a traditional community service element of what 910 The Fan does. And I've kind of gained the title of the voice of high school football in Richmond, and that's not a title I take lightly. I'm very honored by that.
And you've gotten all those wonderful awards, well-deserved for you. I know Virginia Sportscaster here also in your background, and you're certainly one of the best to do it. And I've gotten a chance to sit by you and Robert Fish and some others during the years, during some state basketball tournament games over at VC, which is always fun in Richmond come March. But as we're talking football here, it's interesting, Gary, that Highland Springs Varina game, I'll go to that for a second, because you got to witness another classic between those two, and we'll see those teams potentially against 7-5-7 teams. You never know. Highland Springs moving up this year from Class 5, where they beat Maury a year ago at Old Dominion in the state championship game. They lost to them regular season this year. They're now in Class 6 Region A with a couple other Richmond heavyweights in Thomas Dale and Manchester. One of them they've already played. And Varina's in Class 4, a couple years removed from a state championship where they beat Kings Fork from the Suffolk area here in Tidewater along the way in the state semifinals. But it was a 13-0 game at the half for Varina, 13-7 for the longest. In the last 6 minutes, it went bonkers with the offenses, did it not?
It really did. And it was kind of funny because Coach Chris was talking during the game about how familiar in the first half, about how familiar the teams are with each other, and they know what they're going to do. And then the wild card was when quarterback Linwood Johnson of Varina got hurt, and this freshman Caleb White comes in, and he's running around and flinging the ball downfield, and that's an element that maybe Highland Springs wasn't quite ready for. And you blink your eyes, and it's 13-0 at the half. And, Highland Springs fights their way back, takes a 13-12 lead, First play, White's throws an 80-yard bomb on a wheel route to Nasir Smith, and Highland Springs is behind the ball again. But as we said in post-game extra, Christian Martin, when push came to shove, did what I like to call Christian Martin things and wheeled his team to victory, driving them down the field for the winning touchdown there with under a minute to go.
Just a wonderful quarterback is Christian Martin, a Maryland commit for Lauren Johnson Springers, who are going for another state championship. Got to watch him last year against Maury over at Old Dominion in the state championship. Got to see him in a preseason scrimmage against Thomas Dillon. He's just calm, cool, and collected in crunch time. But I want to go to that Weiss kid for a second because funny story, Gary. I was walking out of the parking lot the night Verona beat Indian River early in the season. It was late August, early September. And right there next to me, going to the car, was KJ Weiss, the state player of the year in basketball for Verona. That is the older brother of the quarterback you just mentioned, and his dad. And they said, hey, watch out for the younger Weiss. He's a pretty good quarterback. And I'm thinking, all right, dad's saying that, little brother, all right. And lo and behold, he ends up almost being the hero in that game. So I don't know that you'd say it's a quarterback controversy or quandary necessarily here for Verona and Coach Lewis here, but it will be worth, I think, watching moving forward, as they're in a very, very fierce region where you have the likes of King George, who's unbeaten, and Dinwiddie, who's the reigning state champs. That's a very, very good region, as good as there is probably in the state.
It's interesting. You mentioned the possibility of a quarterback controversy. I'm not sure about that, but it was interesting because during the broadcast, Stu Brown texted us about White. Brown, while retired from coaching, is helping with the John Rolfe Middle School team, which feeds into Verona, and is still breaking down film and stuff for Coach Lewis. And he texted us and said they lost to Highland Springs in the JV game the day before, and it was his first loss since 2020. And so that was very interesting. But in 4B, I don't know. I don't know how injured Linwood Johnson is, but I think they certainly, if they need to go to the backup quarterback, certainly have a lot more confidence. Maybe they knew what they had. I'm not sure. But I would imagine they'll get some of that ironed out this week against Patrick Henry, and then see what they can do in the playoffs. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not exactly sure how good King George is, but I know Verona is very good. And Dinwiddie, even though they have 3 losses, if you look at the schedule, they're not 3 everyday losses. Dinwiddie's going to be a tough out as well. And in the lower half of that bracket, watch out for Powhatan. That is a team that is peaking at the right time and is going to be a dangerous opponent in the first round.
Dino here. We're talking with Gary Hess, the voice of Richmond High School football, here, our guest on the Hash with Hatfield. You can follow him on Twitter too, or X as they call it now, at GHessRVA for more. They put out links to all the broadcasts they got coming up. He'll tell you who they got this week. He and Gary Criswell on the call for that. Sticking with Class 4 for a sec before we go up to Class 6 with Highland Springs and Dale and Manchester and some others here. There could be a state semifinal matchup, Gary, with either a Verona, a Dinwiddie, or maybe a King George and Phoebus, who's won the last 2 state championships in Class 3, known for their great defense. Offense can be a little hit or miss at times. They won a 10-2 game with Warwick. I'll be really fascinated to see if someone like a Verona or a Dinwiddie, even a King George, could put the Phantoms behind a couple of scores, how the Phantoms react, because they got the longest winning streak in the state. They're known for that great defense, but that could be a dream state matchup in the semifinals, not the championship.
It would be an amazing game to see, and everybody up here who's in Division 4 knows Phoebus looms in that side of the bracket. But, Verona is an interesting team to me because they have the defense to go with the offense. But Dinwiddie's interesting from an offensive standpoint. Their defense may not be quite as good as it's been in recent years, but their offense, they still have a guy named Harry Dalton, and Harry Dalton can put anybody behind by a couple of scores. So, it would be interesting to see how Phoebus would respond to that. And speaking about Verona and Dinwiddie, that's 2 teams that I know are at least capable of putting Phoebus in that position.
A common theme with a lot of these teams, you got championship level defense, great coaches, quarterback play that can make things happen with their arm or their feet, like Dalton Kenny can do it both ways there for Billy Mills and the Generals. And it should be a lot of fun as we get to the playoffs here. And, you mentioned
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Matt, while you mentioned Dinwiddie, I just want to take the opportunity to give Coach Mills a shout out. This past Friday against Meadowbrook was his 200th win. And that anytime a coach gets to 200, that's worth noting.
Absolutely. You don't see too many of them, especially nowadays, because it's I mean, when Mike Smith got to 500, I was sitting there going, how in the world do you get 55? That's 50 years of 10 wins. That's still 20 wins of 10 years in that Central District, which is a bear when you got to play Thomas Dale and Matoka, who's on the rise, which we'll probably touch on in a moment, in 5C. Hopewell, who's a state caliber team we'll get to in Class 3. They've run into Phoebus a couple of times, won a couple of championships under Ricky Irby. It is no small feat. I know you've got to love this, Gary. I do. When you're seeing the Dinwoody's, the Thomas Dales, the Highland Springs and the Varinas playing teams like Maury, Phoebus, and even outside the 757, 804 area codes, teams around the state that are powers, you got to love that they're beefed up the schedules, regular season. We had some great matchups in early September, late August that I think is going to prep these teams for the championship runs, don't you think?
Oh, I think it's, they say iron sharpens iron, and that's a great example of that. And a lot of times, that comes at the expense of now some of these districts are allowing some district matchups to go by the wayside, and it's benefiting the power teams, but it's also benefiting, I think of Colonial Heights as a great example. Colonial Heights is having a great year. They're 6-3. They're going to be a Division III playoff team. But, Thomas Dale, even though they're both in the Central District, is not on the Colonial schedule anymore. And they're able to schedule a few more games against like-minded and similar-sized opponents. And it helps Colonial Heights, but it also helps Thomas Dale. So I think that has opened the door for that. In some cases, it's happened with Highland Springs in the Capital District as well. And it has allowed, those teams have gone out and sought competitive matchups. And Highland Springs, traveled to Florida, had a team from Maryland come down and play them. So, and of course, in recent years has played the team from North Carolina and Martinsburg, West Virginia. So, some of these schools are not shy about finding places to play competitive games. And I love the fact that Maury, Maury obviously is extremely good, played both Highland Springs and Dinwiddie during the regular season. I think that's awesome. And it's great theater, and it's certainly great for high school football fans.
For sure. It's amazing they got both of them beat and actually had to come from behind against Dinwiddie in the halftime break there. And they're winning district games now by 70 points per game. I'm going to go to Hopewell here. Class 3, Ricky Irby's got a great team. I know Kashawn Henderson's been dinged up, missed 3 offensive line starters, but they had a heck of a ball game, almost beat Thomas Dale. I believe I saw you and Gary mention on your post-game extra you're big fans of the quarterback, Makari Tatum. I am too. I watched some of his dazzling moves against Lake Taylor in a blowout win earlier this year. What's your thought on the Blue Devils there in Region 3A, where Lake Taylor hasn't been as strong as they've been? Still can be a factor. Lafayette's good, other Bay Rivers, but you feel like if they get out of that bracket, they can make it back to the state finals, and that's even with a couple of teams that are top-level squad squaring off this week in Kettle Run and Brentsville District out of that 3B. What's the feeling on the Blue Devils in 3A there?
I think at the 3A level, and that's meaning no disservice comparing D3 to D6. But, I mean, you get the rosters of the two teams we were getting ready for the game, and Thomas Dale just has so many more players, and Hopewell's just a smaller school. They were missing 3 of their 5 offensive linemen, but I cannot tell you enough how impressed we were with Makari Tatum. It's not just athleticism, but it's presence, it's moxie, he got hurt, he came back in the game, didn't let it affect him at all, Kashawn Henderson was back this week, but he got banged up again. And so we're extremely impressed. And I think Hopewell is going to be an extremely difficult out in the Division III playoffs. I think, I'm not going to proclaim that they're going to win the state title like they did in 17 and 19, but I think they are a team that's capable of making that kind of run. Undoubtedly, and you look at a 6-3 record, but their losses are to Matoaka, Thomas Dale, and Dinwiddie. Once again, the Central District strikes again. But Hopewell is going to be very, very tough, especially in the regional, because unless they get shocked by Prince George this week, the road to that regional title is going to go through Murner Field and Hopewell, where they're extremely tough.
Is there a surprise team out there in the field? You mentioned about the improvement Colonial Heights has made in recent years here. I mean, we kind of know who the state caliber contenders are when you look at the likes of Highland Springs and Thomas Dale and Manchester and Hopewell and Varina, and the list goes on and on. Is Matoka maybe that team for people outside the 804? Because you all know how good they are. You've seen them. But for those outside of that area might not realize this could be a team that can win Region 5C and go in the States.
I think that is absolutely the case. Matoaka is a team that locally a lot was expected of, and they kind of fell off the radar because they lost their opener to a War Hill team that you and I know is extremely good. And then they kind of fell off the radar. Their only other loss is a 3-point loss to Thomas Dale, and they are extremely good. and Patrick Henry of Roanoke at the top of that bracket, and Louisa's up there as well. And so those of us up here in the Richmond area are used to that 5 C bracket being Richmond exclusive. That's not the case anymore. But Matoaka is definitely one of the teams to beat in that bracket. The other team that I think has surprised a lot of people, not that I think that they're a candidate to go to the state playoffs, is Glen Allen. Glen Allen in the 4 spot in Division 6 is 7-2. Their only losses, I can't remember one, but the other one was I know they lost to Thomasdale and Verino, their only losses. And so Coach Perry Jones has got a really good Jaguars team. If things go if they get the win over Mills Goblin on Friday, they'll probably host Oscar Smith in the first round of the playoffs. But Perry Jones has done a great job. I think Glen Allen is probably the team that has surprised the most in the Richmond area.
Without a doubt, you're spot on, Gary. I watched them in a preseason scrimmage against Grassfield, coached by his brother, Joe Jones, and they look like they were coming in maybe a year away, but they're ahead of schedule. I like what he's doing there, and what a storyline that'll be in the first round. He gets to play his old school and Oscar Smith potentially and get to host them. That is just as good as it gets, and Oscar Smith has been known for its prowess over the years. Not having their typical year, similar to like a Lake Taylor out of Norfolk, but that's the Region 6A where you have the top 3 seeds, top 4 seeds, in fact, are Richmond schools right now with the likes of Dale, new starting quarterback with Ethan Minter going down, the UVA commit, Highland Springs, a perennial power, Manchester, who took them to the wire earlier in the year. How do you break down that region? Because I think I said it back in August telling someone those semifinal matchups could be like championship level games. Those could be epic.
It's Coach Chris and I went and watched. We didn't broadcast the game, but we went and watched a good chunk of the Oscar Smith Hermitage game back in opening the season. And Oscar Smith is good. I don't know that they're as good as they've been in the past. I think that's obvious. But Highland Springs, I think, is still the team to beat. But the margin is not what it's been. Thomas Dale, obviously misses the leadership of Ethan Minter, but the replacement at quarterback, Ethan Medley, is extremely talented. Coach Kevin Tucker told me he would start for most teams in the area. Before I ever saw him play, and we did the Dinwiddie game, and I was like, wow, he's right. And so Thomasdale hasn't missed a beat, but I'll tell you, the team you got to watch is Manchester. Manchester pushed Highland Springs to the limit. They've won every game since. They are kind of lying in the weeds in that 3-hole. I think they're a dangerous team to watch, but Oscar Smith and Glen Allen in that 4-5 game in those huge 3 power schools from the Richmond area, the D6 playoffs are going to be must see radio and in-person football, because that's going to be great stuff.
You make a great point about Manchester, because they beat Dale in a heck of a ball game last year to get to the region final, fell against Western Branch, but they brought back a lot of pieces, including that pass-rushing menace in Mackay Byerson off the edge there at defensive end. He can wreck a game for sure. Well, I'll get you out on this one here, Gary, and I look forward to catching up with you again here come state playoff time. Where can people catch your action? You and Gary Criswell on the call, all the stuff you do, and who's your game this week? Is it a private school matchup, I believe I heard you say this past weekend?
So, Matt, in my 30 years, if you take the 34 schools that make up the central region and the 4 major private schools locally, there are only 5 schools where I've never called one of their games. And 2 of those schools are Benedictine and Trinity Episcopal. They're power schools in the VISAA. And so that is our game Friday night. I'm going to check 2 schools off my list and have it down to 3. And so that's our game this week. We're very excited about that game. The other game we're really going to be watching up here is Dinwiddie and Matoaka. Boy, is that going to be a great battle as well. So that's our game. We'll be on, if you're in the Richmond area, old school terrestrial radio, Sports Radio 910 The Fan, which is 910 AM and 105.1 FM. We're also available on the Odyssey app, AUDACY, and at thefanrichmond.com. There's a listen live link where you can hear what we're doing as well. And of course, all of that information will be available on the 804 Football with Gary and Gary Facebook page and on my Twitter feed at GHessRVA.
Outstanding first class all the way. Gary Hess, he and Gary Criswell giving you the wall-to-wall action of high school football each and every Friday night. That'll be a good one with Benedictine and Trinity. And I watched Benedictine early in the year, Gary. They put up 361 yards of offense against Western Branch. That quarterback, Cody Shelton, who once played for the Lancers of Manchester, had about 225 passing and rushing, completed nearly 80% of his throws. He's a good one, and that's going to be a fun game. It even could be a track meet. So you and Gary have to buckle up. It could be back and forth.
Yeah, it could be, and it's going to be fun. The defense has been there for Benedictine all along, getting the quarterback was the missing piece, and it's a great addition. And Cody Shelton's had a great year. I'm excited to see Benedictine play, and Trinity has a sophomore receiver, Davion Brown, who is unbelievable. Excited to see him as well. So yeah, we are looking forward to it, and it's neat that we get to call a private school game. That's not something we get to do very often.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the time today, Gary. All the best to you and Coach Chris, and I look forward to catching up with you guys come December as we get to the state playoffs. Yeah,
back at you. Keep up the great work, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You got it. That's the one and only Gary Hess. You can follow him on Twitter or X at GHessRVA. We'll take a timeout and come back with the finishing touches of this edition of On the Hash with Hatfield as we've turned the calendar from October to November. Now we hear from a couple of our sponsors at the Plex.